And Kayla is not here tonight, and so we have a person, Nani is going to step into her place. And
Yep.
so we'll start by having you call the roll.
Yep, I'll be calling roll tonight. And 2 notes before we proceed. 1, if you're firsting or seconding a motion, please say your name just for my benefit. And also, since the last meeting, we've reviewed the bylaws, and if you have an abstention or a nay vote to anything, please vocalize it, because in the event of that, we do have to take a roll call vote. So, as per our commission. Anyway, so let's get started. Commissioner Boland,
Here.
Commissioner Phelps,
Here.
Commissioner Gordon,
Here.
Commissioner Griswold, Commissioner Hull,
Here.
Commissioner Kleinman. Here. Commissioner Parsons.
Here.
Commissioner Sims.
Tim Sanderson, Andrew Sims.
Okay. And Commissioner Trudeau.
Here.
Sergeant Bill Clock.
Here.
Commissioner Dolan.
Here.
Commissioner Hess.
Here.
Commissioner Lazarus. Commissioner Margolis. And Commissioner Webb. And we do have a quorum. We have 6 voting members present, so let's proceed.
Great. I'll take a motion to approve the consent agenda unless somebody has any corrections to the agenda or minutes.
So moved, Parsons.
Okay, seconded by,
Boland.
all right, ready, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Great, then we have minutes. And then we have public commentary, and so we allow 3 minutes. And out of our vast public,
Hi, my name's Clark Chernesky. Hello again. Last month when I was here, I told you about the Windsor Connector, the proposal by members of the Michigan Association of Railroad Passengers to have bus service linking Ann Arbor, Dearborn, Detroit to Windsor, Ontario, in order to connect with the trains to Toronto. I handed out to you earlier this evening an issue of the Michigan Passenger, which our organization has been publishing for more than 40 years, and it has a rather complete article about that proposal. For the people in our vast home audience there, they can pick them up at the Amtrak station. They're on a table there. Watching the city council meeting the other night, I see that they're kicking back to you some proposals, including a reconfiguration of Traverwood Drive. I went out there, I use that about 3 times a week at least, and if you're parking on Traverwood and want to go to the library, go up to the sidewalk, there's a rather steep embankment to climb there. It was mentioned, I think, last month that that had been regraded. Well, what the library did is actually replace some stones with some mulch. So I was able to get up, but coming back down was kind of a harrowing experience. You get about 2/3 of the way down the incline, and then you couldn't stop and just kind of ran down into the street. So that's one thing that would have to be corrected. Also, it would add, I estimate, somewhere around 60 to 70 more spaces of parking along Traverwood. I looked at the area trying to think, well, where else are there public parking places? And I saw that there was about a square or a quarter of a square mile out there that has approximately 25 public parking places. I'll give you an idea of how big a quarter of a square mile is. That's Ann Arbor's downtown, bounded by State, Huron, Maine, and Madison. So you imagine downtown Ann Arbor with 25 parking places. So there is a need. Sometimes there's special events going on at the library. Occasionally, some of the businesses along there or residences, they may need a little more parking. And there's no place else to go. You go along there and all these signs, you know, customers only, employees only, library patrons only, things like that. So I think there's a need for such a thing. And traffic on that road isn't that heavy. I think it was kind of over-engineered with the center turn lane. So I think it could accomplish that. It would add about 60 parking places without adding additional impervious surfaces like off-street parking lots would. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that I'm not seeing who'd like to speak? I don't believe so. Great, then we're done with public commentary. And Nani has a presentation on communication.
Hi, everyone. So this is a brief presentation. It'll be followed by a Q&A by the Senior Assistant City Attorney, who has just stepped out, Christopher Frost, but I'm going to give the first part. So per Commissioner request, we're really going to go over Commissioner communication guidelines, which includes FOIA, social media, and inter-commissioner communications. So first of all, FOIA, just a reminder that almost all commission communications can be FOIA'd even though you are not staff, you're members of a public body, so it still applies. FOIA applies to all forms of written communication. That includes emails, texts, handwritten notes, anything that is written down somewhere. And a good rule of thumb is always CC Kayla, and if you don't CC Kayla, then you are responsible for holding onto those materials yourself and then disclosing them if there is a FOIA request. It's easiest just to CC her because when you get FOIA'd, she gets FOIA'd too. So, social media, whenever you are speaking about public business or business that is of interest to the commission or the city, please disclose that you are not speaking on behalf of the commission. In order to speak on behalf of the commission, you can either obtain permission from Linda Diane Felt as the chair, or from the commission as a whole, you can vote to approve someone to speak on a certain topic. But you don't have to proceed every posting that you post with not on behalf of the commission, just the ones that are related to city business. And then lastly, communications between commissioners. As you have probably learned, avoid a quorum if you're going to a public meeting. Notify Kayla if you think that there will be other commissioners there so that she can help mitigate and avoid a quorum from occurring. And beyond that, generally, just try not to discuss how you're going to vote, the pros and cons of a vote or a subject coming before the commission, because we want to have it as transparent as possible and have the complete discussion occurring at the commission meeting for the public to view instead of outside of commission meetings. But yeah, and there's Chris Frost. So he is now available for question and answer if you have follow-ups on FOIA, any FOIA exemptions, or anything about commissioner communications. Thank you.
Okay, this is your chance. If you have questions about what just happened as far as us being FOIA'd, or the future, anything else? I do have a couple of questions, but
I have a small question about avoiding quorum. So I guess my first question is just how many of us makes a quorum?
That's a good question. What do we get?
Six. So 6 is a quorum. So the idea is just that there shouldn't be 6 of us all in one place at the same time ever?
Yes, 6 voting members.
Even if, and is this only like a public meeting, or like say we're all at Top of the Park, like?
No. Public events is really what we're going.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a social gathering or a chance gathering, it wouldn't count unless you started talking about commission business. So if you do find yourself in that situation, don't talk about commission business. It's just easier to avoid the quorum in any case.
it's also possible to have a social event, but it's important to notify the city ahead of time, and then also make sure that everybody knows that it's a social event and you cannot speak of commission deliberations or anything like that. We did that with the Pedestrian Safety and Access Task Force, with special permission.
Yeah, I had one question. If you're like discussing like putting together like a resolution for the commission or something, or want to pass a resolution on that, how should you proceed to not run afoul of the Open Meetings Act? Because I know it's like hard to necessarily do all the discussion, to write all the words like during a commission meeting. That would just take too long, but.
Yeah, and some of this is just the burden of being a public body, but in those cases, the best solution that people find is that get a couple, 3 people together to work on a draft. Beforehand, you can even get a sense from the commission of, what are we looking for? Give a couple people an assignment to do that. Circulate it to the commission ahead of time, so when you come, you can be ready to discuss changes and that sort of thing. You might then have to go back and make additional changes. It might take a meeting or 2 to do that.
So you can discuss stuff if you don't have a quorum?
Yes.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
I have some questions about the FOIA and retention. What Nani just said, and I just want to double check that, is that if we have carbon copied somebody on the city with that information, then we do not need to retain any records of that?
Yes, that's,
Okay. And if it's communication between another commissioner, which may or may not be exempted according to the advisory exemption that's allowed, is there a requirement for retention, and what are the rules about that? Since none of us actually have that rule or capacity necessarily.
yeah, it's going to
Okay.
depend on the nature of the communication. So for example, if you were working on a resolution with a couple of other commission members, and you're talking about what the content of that is, you'd need to retain that. In those cases, for most of those communications, it's going to be 2 years. Depending on the nature of it, though, it may be permanent. So in those situations, you may want to, you can do this maybe if you leave the commission, or once a year, or at the same time, is probably the best, is to just forward those on when you're done with them. Collect them together and forward them on to the staff so that they can retain them for you.
So I know you said have 2 or 3 commission members draft something and then share it with the whole commission, but what happens then? Because if you're sharing it with the whole commission, then you're sharing it with a quorum of the members. And-
Yeah, the important thing is that you're not discussing it
Oh, so
further
you
with them.
can't-
So you can write it and just say, here's for your information, this is what I'm bringing to the next commission meeting. And actually, the best way to do that is to send it to your staff liaison and have them forward it to all the other commissioners.
But you can't discuss it there.
Yeah, so don't reply. That's the danger if you copy everybody. You don't want to get into a reply-all situation
I see.
deliberately or inadvertently, which, as we know, happens.
So it seems like a better answer to the retention policy would be to say that if you have records at the end of your term, then they should be forwarded to the staff liaison if they haven't already been,
Yeah.
rather than relying upon a private citizen to retain FOIA-able records forever.
Yeah, and that's why we do recommend that you copy your staff liaison, even if it's a discussion about
Right.
content or
But,
what have you.
but you're also implying that the responsibility to respond to a FOIA request may be forever.
If you have the records, and they are city records, you may be responsible for producing them. So that's why we, again, recommend
Right, the
copy.
definition of if they're city records is,
And again, it's case by case. So if, some things that are transitory, if you're just scheduling a meeting, for example, can you meet now, can you meet then? We don't need to retain that. But if you get into any kind of substantive discussion, then you're going to need to retain that.
which, just so you guys know, we ended up turning over all records to the city, not to Chris, but to another city attorney, who then made that determination. And so there was an if easily with what was asked for, and the determination was made that most of that was not FOIA-able because of the exemptions that were allowed.
Yeah, if it's not a public record to begin with, if it's, for example, not talking about commission business, because I'm sure that some of you folks talk about things other than this business, then that wouldn't be a city record, and that wouldn't then need to be turned over. And then you would look at the ones that are city records and evaluate, the nature of them and whether they're responsive to the request and if there are exemptions. So,
Right. But it reaches further than you would think.
the problem is we need to see them before we can determine whether
Right.
they're city
Right.
records, because it's all case by case.
Which has its own,
So a couple sort of detail questions, so maybe I can just rattle off you can answer one by one instead of trying to keep them all in your head. Can we define what commission business is?
Well, again, the trouble is it's case by case, but if it's related to your duties or your job as a commissioner, so if you're talking about anything on the agenda, for example, if you're preparing a resolution, even if you are discussing scheduling a subcommittee meeting, that would be a record.
So if I was discussing the pros and cons of road diets, just in general, within the United States and current practices and comparing it to Europe, is
Yeah, I
that
mean,
something that's?
again, it may depend, if you're doing it with another commission member,
Okay.
That's pretty close to what you do here, so,
So, and then if it's not a commission member, like I reached out to a friend who was involved with road diet in Iowa, and we just talked. I mean,
Yeah.
is that fine? It's limited to commissioners and staff or something like that?
it's not the person, it's the content of it. So if you're saying, hey, I'm on this commission, I need an idea, and you're soliciting that information, it may be.
Okay.
So again, it's very context dependent.
Would you recommend that I CC Kayla on all my, I mean, I work in the bicycle industry,
Yeah, if you
involved
have,
with a whole bunch of
if you have a
nonprofits.
question about that, you're welcome to call our office, and we
Okay.
can advise you on that if you think, I mean, a little bit of it, you gotta use your common sense. If
Yeah.
it's not related to something that's directly in front of the commission or something that you're going to be working on, then probably
Yeah.
not, but.
And then I typically do all of my commission business on a Gmail account,
Mhm.
and then I also have other email accounts affiliated with work and nonprofit stuff.
Mhm.
Are those foiable as well? And I suppose it depends on the
Yeah,
content. and if I-
it's the record itself, the communication itself. So if you send it from a different account, that's not gonna change whether it's commission business or not.
And is that true of text messages as well?
Yes.
And then how about phone conversations?
If there's a recording of it, the conversation is not a record in and of itself, but if there's a recording of it, you might want to find out why your person is recording you on the other end, but, but then it would be a record.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
thanks.
So I was just going to ask, like, a sort of thing that I've done some is point some member of the public to the right place on the website to find the information that they were looking for.
Yeah.
I don't have to say that disclaimer in that sort of situation, do I?
No, unless they're, if they're asking you a question about, if they're just asking where to find something,
Yeah.
that's not necessarily a record. But
Well, or if I'm saying, oh, you might be interested in this information, this seems relevant.
in that case, maybe again, it's sort of a
Okay.
context question, so.
Okay.
But I'm happy to answer specific questions if you have them about specific records, we can,
Okay.
and then maybe, you can get a feel for
Yeah, thank you.
type of thing.
I have a social media question. Actually, I probably have a couple.
Don't use it.
So tweets, which are publicly available already, are they foiable as well?
Well, again, it depends on whether it's a city record or not. If you're putting something on social media that is just talking about, saying, here's the meeting or whatever, then that's not going to be necessarily a public record. But if there's any kind of dialogue, then
So-
you're getting into more of a question.
I have a very concrete example. Yesterday, I was reading about road diets, and I tweeted about reading about road diets, specific Ann Arbor ones, and someone said, oh, I missed my chance to comment on this other road diet. And I was like, oh, I'm not reading those ones. I'll figure it out for you if there's a chance to public comment. Is that commission business?
Possibly, possibly. Yeah. This is sort of a gray area.
But the tweets are public to begin with. You don't need to FOIA something which is already public.
Yeah, I mean, you could point to them
Yeah.
easily if they're public.
So the same thing with Facebook. Some of it is semi-public, but,
Well, I think you might need to sign up for Twitter or Facebook to see them, but
right. It's a complex thing.
I'll say the challenge is if you are FOIA'd, finding the stuff,
Yeah.
especially for even like public things like tweets. It's like, did I tweet about something relevant to this thing? I don't. And so, yeah, so we're in a weird, like, I think social media has really changed things. I think when it was direct communication with, emails and memos and letters, like, that's pretty straightforward, but the volume and sort of this sort of ambiguous space that communication lives in now, it can get really challenging to just keep track of things and figure out where to find them. When we got our FOIA request, I spent a ton of time just like making sure I didn't post something somewhere about the things we were FOIA'd about, and it's incredibly time consuming. And yeah, I don't know how to get around that, like, especially given the ambiguous nature of what's a public record. Like, a lot of the things I sent the attorney were not considered sort of a record. So it's frustrating. And yeah, I don't know if I have advice for that, but figuring out how to manage that in a reasonable way. Because I think everybody here is operating in good faith, and I think that's generally true throughout the city. But given the contentious sort of political environment and people using these tools as weapons, I guess just be careful, yeah.
I do have one final question, for me at least, which is, have any other commission, is this a common thing for commission members to be FOIA'd?
It does happen. Not
So it's
all the
happened in the
time,
past.
but it has happened, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
And like I say, if you need more specific advice, or if you have a situation arises, feel free to call us and we can walk you through it.
Great. And copy Kayla on everything. If it's not relevant, she knows how to discard it. Thank you. Then we have a presentation on the CIP. You've come back again.
I'm back again. I'm going to keep it pretty brief tonight. I look upon this mostly as setting the table for your CIP committee for the next round of looking at what's coming up. So I believe everybody here is pretty familiar with the process, and in your homework assignment, you had the opportunity for like a refresher, but during questions, if anybody has a process question, by all means, answer it. But the only process stuff I really wanted to hit on briefly is just the reminder that while the CIP is always a 6-year cycle, in the odd years, we're in what we call a modification year. So we only, this fall, will be looking at tweaks to what's in the fiscal year 20 and 21 schedules. And as a reminder, we start our fiscal years on July 1. So even though we're in 2019 calendar, we'll be starting fiscal year 20 in a couple of weeks. So we're really looking at starting a 2-year cycle here with July of this year. And so we don't add new projects in the modification year, generally unless there's something of an emergency nature that has come up. So we're more looking at schedule and budgets and so on. So the biggest thing that you had to look at tonight is I just culled out of the CIP any of the transportation projects that will be spending money in fiscal years 20 and 21. Now, some of these could have started in 19, but the spends that are reported here are the spends we anticipate in that year. And something in 21 could continue to spend money in 22. So the money's not so much the issue, but sometimes it's helpful to see that. Also, there's a little blue link that says data sheets. So particularly for those of you who are on the CIP subcommittee, if you click on that and you go to, say, active transportation, you will see a brief data sheet on each of these projects. So that'll probably answer a lot of your basic questions on what the scope is. But if you remember, the procedure that we've kind of set up is that, and I believe the subcommittee in particular has been doing the heavy lifting on it, is looking at the upcoming projects and identifying some that there was a memo that went out at some point saying, you know, you're looking for the big projects where the input and additional scoping from this group could come into play. So that's kind of what you want to do. I mean, certainly all of you, and probably channel your feedback through your subcommittee, and then ultimately you want to let Kayla know you know, the projects like you've done in the past. I think last year you selected maybe the Pauline project and some others that you want a little more focus on in terms of making sure all the things near and dear to your heart are, in the scope, pet improvements, bike improvements, whatever things that are helping advance the transportation policies of the city and, the goals of this commission. So, if you look, you probably notice that in streets in particular, there's quite a significant emphasis on capital preventive maintenance. And generally, those projects, we don't even name them because we may go into an entire subdivision and do a light treatment on all of the streets, like we did Turnberry last year, for instance. So that's a pretty significant spend. And then the actual annual local street resurfacing is another big spend project. And that happens every year, but with council's Fix Our Roads goal, we have 2 local streets for every 1 major, and the locals are not up to where, none of them are up to where we want our total goal by 2025, but we're advancing right on par, I guess you would say, towards the goal on majors, but we're not keeping up primarily because you have twice as many to take care of and less budget. So there's quite a bit of emphasis on that. And then probably the most significant project you'll see in there is the First and Ashley project, which I think all of you are familiar with. Have they already been providing any input on First and Ashley or not? Those of you who are on the subcommittee? I don't think so, but I would just point that out as one you might want to take a look at. Very multifaceted. It's got the conversion from the one-way back to two-way. It's got pet improvements. It's got bike improvements. It's a pretty robust project. And one of the other big ones, spend-wise, is actually just some very expensive concrete repairs on South Industrial. And South University, there's not a big spend, but that is actually a pretty significant project being done, actually led by the University of Michigan, with the city sitting at the table throughout the design process and contributing money, but that will be a major redo of South U. And then parking facilities, always run by the DDA itself, pretty straightforward. Other transportation, just a reminder, is where the projects that don't fit in terms of active, which is all your ped and bike and so on, they aren't fixing the street. So there we get into DDA streetscape projects, signs and signals projects, things like that. So you can take a look at those. And then airport and bridge, and even new streets is a little bit of a misnomer in some senses, because if we pave a gravel street, we throw that in the new streets. And the folks on Hollywood have actually petitioned in those couple of blocks, and it's the first one that's gotten that far in years of people choosing to say, let's at least get this going and take it through the special assessment process and see where it goes. So not a big project, but one that's actually going to have some activity in new streets. And then, of course, the active transportation area is one that I know you folks focus on quite a bit, so you can see what's coming up there. Not necessarily huge projects, but for instance, the Fuller Court sidewalk gap filling has been a high request project for some time. So basically, that's all I really want to cover tonight, is make sure you've got this list, you know how to get to the data sheets, and then to answer questions. So I'm going to flip right to that. I also know, looks like you got a couple things added to your agenda, so maybe I'll shave a couple minutes off for you. But what kind of questions do folks have, either about specific projects or process? Be happy to answer anything. Yes, Tim?
Yeah, I see the Ann Arbor Station was repeated under 2 categories. Why is that?
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so transit is where it should be. Where else are you seeing it, Commissioner?
It's at the top of streets.
I think that's interesting because Phase 1 final design, that's very quirky. So I'll have to look at the database. It shouldn't even be possible. So what probably happened is the old code, again, I don't know why it would even be showing up under streets, but I had the finance people grab the things in an Excel spreadsheet for me, so sorry about that. It's not 2 projects though, so good catch.
Yeah, I also saw the quiet zone there. I'm wondering what that is because to my awareness, council hasn't decided to proceed on a quiet zone.
No, they have not made any decision yet, but they had initiated that study, and then out of the study, it identified a potential need. So if you remember, the capital improvement program will, basically memorialize any perceived needs. Whether they advance particular in something like that that takes general funds, that falls into that category that heavily depends on council. And you're absolutely correct that they have been given the results of the survey that was done. And I don't remember exactly, anyway, but something like 73% people who responded to the survey were not in favor of advancing it forward, but ultimately it's council's call because it would require general funds.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering what the $100,000 is, because I know like all the plans they had for the quiet zone cost significantly more than $100,000.
Yeah, so what we do when we program them, and then the timing is what spend would come first, and the next spend, if it advanced, would be kind of a conceptual design phase. So that's what that money is. If it advances, we don't think we'd be spending any big dollars super soon, but we'd start spending money if it's advanced by council. So again, great question. Yes,
Hi.
Commissioner.
So I really appreciate seeing this score sheet and understanding how the prioritization
yeah.
worked. But then it doesn't exactly map onto what is funded first. And so I just wanted to understand that a little bit better. Like, for example, the Arboretum Gallup Underpass tied for second in priority, but it's not being funded for a while, it looks like.
Yes, and that's a question that comes up with regularity. So in the CIP, because there's 3 Ps, as they call them, defining projects that identify a need, prioritizing them, and then programming them. So when you advance to that programming step, the prioritization number alone doesn't guarantee it comes early, because then that good old thing called funding comes into play. And particularly in this project, we're going to have significant outside funding. We have brought it up with the university because it's a high, apparently, on their need schedule also. But we're looking at like TAP funding, and right now, we have a big TAP thing to punch the hole under the berm for the Allen Creek project. That should start sometime this year, hopefully, going out to bid soon. So that one, the funding is such that we can't advance it quite yet. We would, based on prioritization, but it just can't happen yet. Other questions?
A couple real quick. Thank you for the presentation. I was curious, what happens to things like the Safe Routes to School money that was set aside? Does that money just go back into the general fund, or?
Well, most of that funding was outside money with some local match, including, had it gone forward, there would have been assessments to citizens and so on. So there really isn't a whole lot of money to return in that case, because the bulk of it was coming from the Safe Routes to School federal funding source.
So that $347,000 is not actually coming from the city of Ann Arbor?
Correct, most of it was not, so.
And then a quick, and I know I've asked this before, and I can't quite, funds that are coming through the DDA, how does that work? So for instance, there's a lot of active transportation stuff coming together, but this seems more like it's coming through the DDA than it is through the city.
Well, the other transportation in particular has a lot of DDA funding. So, DDA budgets are still approved by city council, but they have a board of their own who, decide on capital improvements. And then there's an ongoing design team with city staff and the DDA. But we put them into the CIP because they are ultimately city funds, just channeled through the DDA. So they're kind of a quasi-city for the purpose of the CIP, so we want them. Also, Housing Commission would fall in that same category, which you don't see in transportation, but that's the other significant group that's in that category.
Thank you.
The other one that puzzles me is the Ellsworth Research Park Drive. I see the prioritization says 3, and the amount isn't that large compared to some of these on here, yet it's pushed to fiscal year 2021. I'm wondering why.
That one has bounced around a lot. One of the goals has always been, there's a Social Security office down there.
Yeah, I know.
And the, bus parking is on the other side of the road, and the initial idea is centered around, getting a better ped crossing and whatever, and we always thought it'd be nice if the buses themselves would circulate
Yeah.
down there. So the focus has shifted with increasing traffic, and Raymond, correct me if I'm wrong, it now meets the warrants to put a traffic signal there. That will open up other opportunities for how the buses can circulate and be able to get back out onto Ellsworth. So now we're into a traffic signal design mode instead. If you have any other comments on that, Raymond, but it's like the logistics now.
So you have to do more planning work before you can do it, is what you're saying?
Are we going after outside funds? I can't remember for the traffic signal, or is that totally inside from Act 51 monies, do you recall?
Oh, I want to say it's Act 51 for the signal work. Yeah.
Okay. And I think that one will probably be at the very beginning of 21. We also were working with the RIDE on some contribution from them, because the bus part is another component of it. And last I knew, we didn't have a firm commitment, and I think when we decided in fall, we were kind of on the 2021 bubble, but there was some logistical reason that we ended up picking 21. That's the kind of thing that if all the stars align and say there's a little money because Northside Steam didn't go or whatever, could end up getting advanced like to the end of 20 as a possibility, but I wouldn't say that for sure.
All right, any other questions? Great, I think we're getting it more and more.
Thank you, and if at any time channel questions through Kayla to me about CIP, and I'll be happy to answer.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
And we are looking for at least one other person to serve on that subcommittee. And so if you're interested, you could volunteer right now, or you could volunteer somebody who didn't come to the meeting tonight, or let us know later. We have a couple other new commissioners, we think, coming on, and so we were going to wait until that time, but let us know. It's a really fun committee.
I'd be potentially interested.
Great. We will talk to you then. Next up is Raymond. Got a couple things to,
Yes, Madam Chair. So the first I wanted to do is give you an update on the lane reconfiguration projects. You may recall that it's been something that we've been reporting to you for, I think, well over a year now. Back in February, we came back to you with kind of our data analysis and some direction from you in terms of how to proceed, which started a public engagement process for Green, Earhart, and Traverwood in particular. And we were preparing things for City Council's deliberation. We came to you last month for your recommendation on the resolutions that were going to go before council. You did not have the benefit of seeing all of the public comments because Traverwood and Green in particular were still open for public comment during your last month's meeting. And so last month, or I'm sorry, on Monday night, City Council, these three items were referred back to the Transportation Commission for further consideration because you didn't have the benefit of seeing the public comment for those. So we did not mark this as an action item because we didn't know what the results of that meeting were going to be. So what we are planning on doing is at your next meeting, bringing that back in its entirety so that you have the full package with all the public comment information, as well as the resolution and the backup technical report that accompanies it, so that you can re-deliberate over those issues again before passing a recommendation on to the City Council. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, but if there are any, if you would like to see any additional information next month that could help you in your deliberation, I seek your guidance now. The other thing too that we're looking for, there was some comment about whether or not we should engage in additional public comment. There was a fair amount of public comment that came in on Earhart. Traverwood and Green had kind of lower numbers. And so it's something that, you know, we're just trying to figure out how to proceed on some of these different aspects for the project before we bring it back for both your consideration and council's consideration. So that's where we're at with it, and I'd be happy to take any suggestions you have or any questions you might have.
Well, so we want to focus the discussion more on the process rather than debating the content of the resolution, unless you want to overrule me on that.
Yeah, I'm wondering, do we, like, I would be curious in seeing, like, how staff, like, responded to the comments. Like, did they make any changes based on some of the comments? And did they have, like, it would be nice to see responses to common comments and/or things that changed based on comments.
Okay?
I have a couple things, and Raymond, I emailed you about this already, but just to share that with the rest of the commission that I requested this. I asked for information about existing city road diets, just to find out what kind of information we have about the impacts of those road diets. What I didn't ask for in my email, but I think might also be useful, is if there was public comment on road diets that we've now had for a while, it might be valuable for us to see what people thought before versus what they think now that something has been in place for a while. So I actually read every comment last night. I'm not going to talk about the content of them today, but I have a question for you, which is that I noticed that particularly for Green, there seemed to be a real bimodal distribution where the people who were commenting online very strongly held one opinion, whereas the people who were present in the public meetings very strongly held the opposite opinion. Do we have any sense of whether the online commenters are also coming from the neighborhood? If these, like, who are these people, I guess is my question. And I'm assuming we don't have a way to know that, but I'm asking anyway.
Yeah, we don't have a way to do that. You know, the online comment in particular is open. We use that open City Hall, you know, forum. And so the way the kind of macro data that's kind of back behind it, there's not really that far that we can dig into it. What I will say, though, generally speaking, is what we try to do is offer different types of engagement so that, you know, some people prefer kind of the face-to-face in-person, and then other people, because of, you know, scheduling difficulties, may not have the opportunity to go to a meeting, and so that's why we offer an online. And you're right, a lot of times it leads to kind of different types of input from those different types of engagement opportunities, but we feel like it's, you know, a process we've tried on several projects, and it seems to give, you know, the most opportunity for the most amount of people, and that's why we try to structure it in such a fashion to allow both avenues for comment.
Thank you.
So I don't know if this is a content question or not, so we can talk about it a little bit, but I was thinking that I think part of the issue might be an education concern and not understanding road diets and their place in contemporary designs, particularly in retrofitting some overbuilt areas. I was wondering if a quick primer on road diets, you know, maybe just summarizing the Federal Highway Administration on the benefits, and then, you know, Raymond, with your experience, maybe you have an example of one from another city that went really well and one that didn't, so we can get sort of context, both for us, but I think those watching at home might also appreciate that.
Sure.
The other thing I noticed in some of the studies that I've looked at, they did before and after, not necessarily speeding, it was travel time through the corridor, and it's generally a remarkably small difference, typically. I'm wondering if we capture those data sets or have in the past, or will be doing so in the future.
We are now, but some of the historic ones, especially the ones that predate like a year, you know, there were a couple that were done last year, North Maple and Stone School, and so we've been doing travel time runs on those. But for ones that predate that, there are some from several years ago, we don't have the baseline data in order to be able to compare. So we could do a travel time run now, but we don't know necessarily what the differential is from, you know, the before condition and the after condition.
So you do have data for Maple?
Mhm.
That would be really great to see what you have.
Yeah, and one of the things to note on Maple as well as Stone School is we had said from the very beginning that we were going to analyze a year's worth of data. And so those haven't quite yet hit
Okay.
the 1-year mark. They're close. They were implemented late summer of last year.
Yep.
And so we're continuing to monitor. We're trying to see if we can do an apples to apples count in terms of month of year. If we took a count in October of 2017, should we wait till October of 2019 to see, as close a comparison as possible? So those are some of the parameters that we're looking at with Maple in particular, to make sure that we have as solid an evaluation and apples to apples comparison as possible.
Totally makes sense. Thank you.
So I saw they told city council that by sending it back to the Transportation Commission, the project wouldn't be set back, but seeing as it sounds like we're not going to make any recommendations this month and move it to next month, then the next city council meeting after that would be in August, and that would seem like it would set it back. Is that in fact the case, and what do you like?
Yeah, so I think it depends. So let me start with Earhart. Earhart, there's no resurfacing that's proposed as part of this phase of Earhart. You may recall that Earhart was meant to just do striping and delineators as a test environment for a year plus until the resurfacing happens in the future. And then at that time, we will have done all of the data collection analysis before, during, and after to see if it worked or not as planned. And then a determination can be made if it needs to be restored back to the way it was before it gets, or when it gets resurfaced, or whether those improvements are made permanent. So Earhart, there's probably more flexibility just because, there's that kind of test case. Now, what I will say is if we want the benefit of doing it as a test, the sooner we implement the test, the sooner we can evaluate it and know before it goes to construction. So, my only cautionary tale is, if we delay it too long, then we won't be able to effectively test it before the actual repaving occurs. Now, Green and Traverwood are a little bit different because Green and Traverwood would have been on the resurfacing list. They actually are on the resurfacing list. And so this was one of those opportunistic, opportunities. That's pretty redundant, but this is one of those opportunities that presented itself because since those roads were being resurfaced, we looked at if they were identified on that road diet list. They were. We analyzed the data, and so that opportunity presented itself. Those will be resurfaced this construction season, and so obviously when we get to August, we start losing time because you never know when frost laws are going to take effect. I mean, typically that doesn't happen until about November, but if August turns into September and September turns into October, then we run into a situation where the road's resurfaced and we don't have direction yet on how to stripe it. And so there are some temporary measures we can do, but it's, again, those come at a cost, right? So if we don't have strong direction, and we don't know how to proceed, then it kind of leaves us in kind of this limbo state. So it's not too, I think, to answer your question in short, August 5th, I think, is that first city council meeting, is not too late. But it is, helpful to get direction at that time, so then that way we know how to proceed with the projects.
All right. So we will give ourselves time for next meeting to go over this. And I assume that the city council did not respond to the education part of our resolution. Is that true?
Well, since they kicked the whole issue back to Transportation Commission, I think that's where that stands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Great. Should we move on to illumination? Great.
All right, Madam Chair, Commissioners, at your request, you had asked us to look at crosswalk lighting and kind of street illumination at the last meeting, and so we thought we'd put together just a really brief presentation to show you some of the considerations that go into what we're doing and kind of the state of affairs that we advance when it comes to crosswalk illumination. So the first thing, you've heard us talk about this before, but I wanted to underscore kind of the direction we're currently moving. First of all, we really try to achieve the highest visibility as possible when it comes to crosswalk lighting, and in particular, positive contrast lighting. You've heard us say that several times. And in a nutshell, what that pretty much means is that the object that is to be illuminated is brighter than the background. And so you can kind of see in this graphic, if you have overhead lighting or if you have lighting that's behind you. So, you know, if this is the crosswalk here, these red boxes, if the lighting is behind you, those are not ideal circumstances, because then what's happening is the background behind you is brighter than the individual that's in the crosswalk, and thus you're not achieving the positive contrast lighting. And so instead, what we try to do is kind of offset the crosswalk lighting kind of near side of the crosswalk about 10 feet out, because what we find is that provides enough illumination to kind of cast light on the pedestrian crossing the crosswalk, as well as kind of the immediate vicinity in front of the pedestrian. And this is done through any number of ways, obviously street lights, but then we can look to co-locate lights on existing, you know, energy poles or any other opportunities that we have out there. The other thing, and it's included in your monthly report, but I figured it probably bears a little bit of mention to go into a little bit more detail. So we evaluate the crosswalk lighting priority based on 8 different criteria, and those are identified on the screen in front of you. The table to the right, it kind of gets down into the weeds a little bit. I know it's a little hard to read, but those 8 criteria are crash history, and so you actually see the kind of sliding scale that we use. So if there's no crash history, there's 0 points assigned to that piece of the component. But if there are crashes at that location that have resulted in serious or fatal crashes, that jumps, you know, gets 10 points for that. Proximity to transit stops, if there are not any transit stops in the immediate vicinity, then you don't get any points. But if there are, boy, I need my glasses. If the crosswalk is less than 300 feet from an existing transit stop, then you get the 10 points, and then there's some scale in between, obviously, as well. City versus the DTE system. So if this is an addition to a DTE light or addition of a DTE light, there's 2 points. But if it's addition of a city, like if it's part of an existing city network, it gets 10 points. And I'll go into a little bit more detail why that scale is the way it is. In large part, it has to do with we prefer to have city-owned and maintained lights because it gives us more control. We can service them a lot quicker and easier. However, there are a lot of technical challenges as to why we can't put every new light on a city system, because if it's not on a city circuit, it's cost prohibitive for us to put a single light out there. And so oftentimes what we end up doing is the one-offs, the single lights that go up are often part of the DTE system. Proximity to popular destinations, so you have a whole list of destinations there, but you know, at the high end of the spectrum, if you're close to a school, a library, a government office, a major commercial, a tractor, or a park, that's where you get the full 10 points, and then there are kind of some other destinations identified elsewhere there. The crash potential talks about whether you are near an intersection and or near sidewalks and bike lanes. So if you're, you know, on a bike lane or a crosswalk and as a mid-block crossing, that gets the full 10 points. The current lighting level speaks to kind of from a network perspective, how much lighting do we have in the area, and is this part of, you know, is this filling a gap, or is this part of a bigger project to illuminate, you know, a corridor, for example. Street classification, if it's an arterial or an urban collector or just a local street, the higher the classification of roadway, the more points it gets. So if it's on an arterial, it gets the full 10 points, and if it's down to the local level, it just gets the single point. And then the last one is public request and desire. This is really just a consideration of how many requests have we gotten from the public on it. So if we haven't gotten any, you don't get any points. If we've gotten some single requests in from individuals, there's some points assigned to that. But if there's an organized group that has, if it's a homeowners association or if it's, some group that's kind of incorporated that has put in the formal request, that counts for the 10 points. One thing to note with this process is that we frequently rescore the streetlights because, for example, if a crash happens, right, we need to enter that back into the hopper. That may bump a streetlight up from where it was previously, up in the matrix. And so this is not a static document. Anytime we get new requests in, we kind of process it and we check to make sure, see how things shake out. So the result of this prioritization process is the map you see here. I know it's a little kind of hard to see at kind of this scale, but it just kind of goes to show that we're currently tracking about 100 different crosswalk lighting locations. And so they're ranked from, we have 10, or I'm sorry, about a dozen at the highest score, 42 in kind of the high, 29 mid, and 34 low, and 14 at the lowest. So this just kind of shows how each of those dots has shaked out in terms of when they went through that prioritization process. I did want to let you know about what the budget is for street lighting. So this current year, fiscal year 2019, which is wrapping up in a few short weeks, there was $115,000 for crosswalk lighting. We are actually oversubscribed on that, or over encumbered by about $64,000. Now that doesn't mean we've spent, $180,000. What that means is we have requests into DTE that surpass the amount of funding that's been available. Any of the city lights that have been put in, those are already taken off the books. We paid for those materials. We paid for the staff time. But we have several outstanding requests to DTE that we're still waiting on. If they get those done by the end of this fiscal year, which again is just a couple weeks away, then we'll have a negative balance on that, which isn't problematic because we have some other streetlight funding sources that we can tap into. But that's kind of where we're at. So we've been busy trying to kind of make a lot of progress on this. Some of it has been held up by DTE's process and kind of the back and forth about location. But we have taken the money allocated to us from City Council very seriously. Looking to next year, that amount is $135,000. So they have increased it by $20,000 and will continue to kind of keep things moving along. On the maintenance side, and I'll speak to this in just a minute why the costs are so high on maintenance, but for quite some time the city had deferred maintenance on the existing streetlight network. And so there was a backlog of needs to go in and fix lights that needed to be fixed, or lights that have kind of reached the end of their useful life. There are several, you think a streetlight is a fairly simple thing, and it seems to be, but there are several different components that could fail. Everything from the concrete base, through the wiring, through the luminaire, through the fixture, through the pole itself. And it depends on what type of pole it is, and so forth and so on. So there's several different things that several years ago we had a consultant help the city identify, do a complete inventory of all of our assets and determine what status they were in, and determine that we needed to start to budget about $530,000 to keep the system up and running and get it where it needs to be. Next year, that budget has been decreased a little bit to $430,000, and part of the reason for it, as I understand it, is under the new streetlight request that you see on the next line, we had $155,000 in 2019. That amount carries over to 2020, and $100,000 was put on that. So that was kind of from the maintenance side. There was the $100,000 peeled off of the 530, which is now the 430, and then goes into the new streetlight requests. So that's kind of how some of that funding got moved around a little bit as part of the budgetary process. So some other considerations that I want to bring to your attention. The first is the DTE versus city-owned streetlights. So we have roughly 8,000 streetlights within the city. So that's not an inconsequential amount. That's a fair number. The split is roughly 1/3 city, 2/3 DTE. Like I mentioned before, when we have single requests that come in, they tend to go to DTE because they have the infrastructure already in place. They have the electricity, and for them it's just a simple task of kind of putting in a pole. I shouldn't say simple because it's more complicated than you realize, or at least more complicated than I realized when I first started talking about streetlights. Typically, with the city, if we're going to put in new lights, we either try to tie into an existing circuit. So, if you think about downtown, those globe lights, the DDA lights, those are on a city circuit. So, we can expand upon those circuits pretty easily. Otherwise, we look to do about 10 lights as part of a new circuit. And so this would be like a new corridor. So, we're currently talking about Packard, for example, the need to add some illumination on Packard. And that would probably reach the threshold that there would be enough lights along Packard that we would kind of put in our own circuit and put up those lights ourselves as opposed to going to DTE. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why we do prefer a city light if we can is because of the outage response time. The signs and signals crew in the transportation department is pretty responsive. And so as soon as we know that a light is out, we have an inventory of replacement parts down at the Wheeler Center. We're able to deploy staff as soon as we know about it. And our response time is within 72 hours of clearance if there's a misdig or anything like that we need clearance from, that as soon as we have clearance to work on it within 3 days, that's up and running. We can't control that quite as easily with DTE. And so it's one of the reasons why, again, if it's a city light, if we can make it a city light, that's our preference. To talk about life cycle cost, we talked about this a little bit above, but just to give you a feel for the cost for a street light is $43,000 over the 40-year lifespan of a street light. And so what we've actually found is it's kind of a wash between what DTE rents us the lights at when we lease a light from DTE versus if we were to do it ourselves. There isn't a real significant cost savings one way or the other. And so for that reason, again, this plays into, does it make sense for it to be a city light or a DTE light? It's just a question of which network we can tie into kind of the most readily. Dark skies is another conversation I'm sure some of you are very familiar with. This is kind of where we're sometimes at crossroads in terms of how we kind of prioritize things. So, there's obviously a desire to make sure that crosswalks are safe and properly illuminated, but then at the same time, there are conversations going on around town as well that we want to make sure we are not adding to light pollution from our urban, context. And so we're trying to find ways that we can minimize that. We've had some discussions with representatives from the Environmental Commission about how we can kind of achieve both ends, that we can, achieve what we want with making sure that crosswalks are properly illuminated, but that we don't have too much spillback lighting and bounce back, that's causing light pollution. Smart streetlights is another conversation that's ongoing. I don't have like a whiz-bang thing to tell you, like, hey, here's the coolest light that we're moving forward with. But some of the conversations that are happening, one is 5G. So many of the cellular providers, the telecoms, are currently pursuing 5G networks. And one of the assets that they're looking to co-locate on are streetlights, as well as traffic signals. I didn't understand that. And so we're looking at opportunities for partnership with those telecoms to say, okay, can you upgrade our light to this fixture, which will allow you to co-locate your 5G antenna embedded within that infrastructure. So that's a conversation that's currently ongoing. The other part of that conversation is what kind of sensors can be attached to streetlights to make them smarter. So kind of two case examples that we're currently looking at is, can we get some sort of detection on a light to tell us whether or not that light is working or not, right? Right now, that process is largely driven by, see, click, fix. You kind of report it into our system. Then we figure out whose light it is. If it's DT's, we report it to them. If it's ours, it reports to us. It would be great if there was a more seamless process. But as you can imagine, with 8,000 lights in the system, even a relatively low-cost item could kind of balloon in cost, but it's something that we're currently considering to see if there's technology out there that can help with that discussion. The other thing too is you may have seen kind of this adaptive lighting that you see it sometimes in grocery stores where the lights are dim in the freezer aisle, but when you start walking down the freezer aisle, the lights come back on. Some communities are actually doing that as well, right? So when there are people present, the lights come on, but if there's nobody present, the lights kind of either dim down or turn off. That's something that some communities are looking at. This could go a little ways to kind of find that common ground with the dark skies discussion. So it's something we're looking at, but we haven't really settled on anything. One thing to note on all of these technologies is many of our systems right now are they're photovoltaic, right? So, you know, when the sun goes down, the lights get triggered to come on, but they're photovoltaic at the circuit level. And so that means to say that the whole circuit is shut down when the sun is up. And the reason why that's important to note is one thing that we've noticed, especially on some of the lights downtown, when the circuit goes down, none of those lights receive power. So if the sensor is dependent upon a power feed, the sensor won't work either, right? So it's one of the, because the whole circuit's down. So those are some of the little like nuances that we're trying to think through, that if we move forward with a certain technology, would the sensor still be able to work even if the circuit's down? Because it's not always just a light bulb that's out, it's, you know, something in the wiring or something else. And then the last thing I wanted to just let you know about is, especially through Dr. Missy Stoltz and her department, Josh McDonald, we are looking to convert all the mercury vapor lights in town to LED conversions. The city, as I understand it, has already converted all of our lights to LED, and this is a process going through with DTE to do that with their lights. And so the payback, the kind of cost differential on that, the payback's quite short in time just because of the cost savings on LED, and it's something that we are actively pursuing. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yes, Scott?
So more of an update and elaboration on a question. So just on the dark skies topic, Planning Commission has been working with the Energy Commission on drafting an ordinance that would not regulate what the city does, because our ordinances do not regulate the city, they regulate private property. But typically the city will go along with whatever sort of regulations are established in ordinances with our own stuff too. Yeah, and we've had a lot of really interesting conversations about what that means. But it isn't no light, it just is more about like shielding the fixture so we're not spilling light back up and for light pollution purposes, but also making sure the lights are as efficient as possible and just lighting what needs to be lit at the level it needs to be lit. Brighter isn't always better. The ordinance also has language about the color temperature of light which has there's all kinds of public health related stuff related to that. So there's a whole lot baked into that process. It's been going on for a while now. Energy Commission has done a ton of work on it. Planning Commission has seen it a few times. So I expect that to be coming forward, and I hope that will inform some of what the city's doing with the street lighting. But it sounds like we're kind of already getting there, except for the downtown globe lights, which are terrible.
That is one of our challenges, to figure out how we can make those work. Yeah.
Can you bring up the map
Sure.
again, please?
And that
So,
map will be provided in completion in the minutes as well.
so I just had a question. So the little blue squares are sufficiently lit crosswalks. Is it correct then that most of our crosswalks are not sufficiently lit? Or maybe I'm just not seeing all the blue dots because they're kind of small and I don't see very well? But I'm surprised, I guess, by what this seems to be saying about the number of sufficiently lit crosswalks versus insufficiently lit crosswalks.
Yeah. You know, I'd have to double check. I don't know if that includes all of our crosswalks or not, or if these are just the ones that have been upgraded over time. So that's a great question. I will get back to you on exactly what that means.
Thanks.
Yeah, one question is, I'm a little confused on this whole city versus DTE circuits thing.
Sure.
It's just a little perplexing because as far as I know, DTE provides the electricity, then what's a city circuit then?
Yeah, so we rent lights from DTE. So DTE has their own streetlight program, and I'm sure they have it all through their coverage area. I'm sure there are lights in other communities that are rented from DTE. And they offer your standard Cobra head light, that you see, kind of, the big kind of ugly street lights, but then they also offer decorative lights. And so the question becomes, if we have a street light that comes in, you're right, we have to pay for electricity for any of them. So this isn't really a question of whether we have to pay for the electricity or whether we generate our own electricity. It's more about who installs the light and who owns the light. Does it make sense for us to contact DTE and say, hey, we have a single light need here. Can you just drop a pole in and a light on your system? Whereas for us to be able to run our own conduit from our own circuit to a single location becomes cost prohibitive. If we have enough that there's a certain density and a certain kind of critical mass of lights, then it's not as cost prohibitive. Then it makes sense for us to do that. So a good example that's happening is actually right in front of this building on Huron. Those were all DTE-owned lights, but then as part of the DDA project, they're upgrading lights, they're putting in more lights. They're replacing enough that those are actually going to be city lights, because we'll have our own circuit now on Huron as part of the DDA project that we will tie into. So again, it's like a master meter, I guess, for lack of a better term, that we have a single kind of energy source that feeds all these lights that we kind of control and maintain. Does that help clarify?
Okay, yeah, it's just a little confused because it's like you talk about your own circuit, but aren't they both plugging into DTE's electricity? I mean,
Yeah.
if DTE has lights over there, why can't you just stick up another light?
Yeah, it has to do with how they meter us and how they charge us for our streetlights. And so it's very difficult for us to do single light installations on our own, because we can't just tap into DTE's thing without having kind of our own circuit. Kind of like if you think about your own meter on your house. Yeah, there might be electricity in front of your house, but you can't just drop an electric line to it. You'd have to set it up properly. And so it's the same sort of concept that DTE can put their lights, because they charge us kind of a flat fee, right? They're not really metering. They just know, okay, this is an LED light of this type, and it's a flat monthly fee. There's installation costs up front that they also charge us. But that's kind of that differential on it.
All right.
I feel like I'm confusing it more
Anything
than we're
else? Because we're sort of over time on this issue. but-
Just really quickly, I found this very helpful. Will all these slides be available to us?
They will be, yep.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on, the next agenda item was to talk about the E's, and this isn't exactly in the position that we had requested it to be, because some people, like myself, did not do all of their homework, owning that completely. And so I think that this information is something that we want to pass on to the transportation update. I always get the title wrong.
Transportation plan update.
Okay. And so I think that there's enough information there, if you've looked it over, to see that it was fairly successful in using the template. And hooray for those people who did actually do their homework. And so my suggestion would be that we keep this moving. And Kayla and I were going to do more work on this before it came to you, but didn't have the time to do that. If you have any comments, suggestions, questions, or anything like that, then we can still incorporate that, but begin to move it towards the transportation update group as it is.
So quick, in terms of equity, I opened up the template and I said, there's no way, this would take like a month for me to research all of this stuff. It's such a new E, right, that it's just overwhelming. But I'm a little bit worried that Commissioner Hull's draft doesn't capture the equity that transportation circles are using. It's not mode share, for instance, and mode access. So I was going to request that city staff could help, like even provide some language and links that we could consider or something like that. If there's somebody who knows better than I do about this E, that would be great.
Okay, we can certainly
Yeah.
ask Kayla if that's possible.
Yeah,
My
I'll pass
report
that on
was
to
based
Kayla.
on my original report. I wasn't trying to bring in any stuff from his report. So, yeah, it just would have been too much work and.
And it's even, we can even say, and this is a work in progress, it's
Yeah,
not meant to
yeah.
capture everything.
I think I mentioned it before, there's like no standard for how you do this, whereas a lot of the others, it's all pilot programs.
Right.
That you'd have to.
Which
do
even
this.
that observation is helpful,
Yeah, yeah,
and so that can be included.
cool.
So if you draft a little bit of that language and send it to Kayla, and then we can also see if there's staff that can help with that part.
That'd be great.
So I know there were a couple of months during the winter that I missed, so maybe we learned more about how the transportation plan update process is going to work. But if not, I think that would be really valuable, for me at least.
So there's a link to that on the notes from the chair,
Okay.
to the website that will start you off.
Right. I went and looked at the older versions. Is there something about the process for the update that's happening? I must have missed it. It's in the notes from the chair.
I think so.
Okay.
That page is pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
And I can ask Kayla to send you along some additional materials that we've been using for the transportation plan update that'll give you a more concrete timeline and an idea of like where your things would be going into it.
That'd be great. Thank
Sorry,
you.
the link in the chair's note is to the Vision Zero plan, is that what you mean by the transportation plan update?
Nope.
I don't see another link in here.
Is it moving together towards Vision Zero? Is that the?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the kind of brand name of the transportation plan.
Oh,
So
okay,
it,
okay.
yeah,
So that
that's
is the
it
same
seems, it's the right spot.
Okay.
Mhm.
So you can start with that, and the Citizen Advisory Group does have public, you can come and observe and comment at the end. And I did just a very brief overview of that first meeting. But the materials are very readily available as well. But Eli is the guy to talk to about that primarily because I think he's the primary contact person, is that?
Yes,
Yeah.
he's the project manager on it.
Yeah, I had clicked on this. I didn't realize it was the same thing.
Okay.
Thanks.
I appreciate that update, and it's good to hear that there's a lot of enthusiastic people and creative thinking going on. So I'd welcome any communications that you want to share with the commission about what you're observing.
Yeah.
It's really helpful. Puts me at ease a little bit too.
Yeah, what was kind of interesting, the one thing I didn't put down in that is that it was interesting that there were some very car-oriented people participating as well, and I hadn't heard that perspective presented so well in quite a while. That's a little bit diplomatic. Not very, perhaps, but it was a very open and well-represented group. It really, enough that I kind of went, whoa, these are people who I've not been listening to recently, and I really appreciate this. That was really nice. And not listening to them because I haven't been around as much, not because I'm closing my ears in any way. Anything else on that? So your continuing participation and comments would be most helpful.
So Madam Chair, I'm sorry if I could just make sure I understand the direction correctly. So we will be forwarding on the work that's been done to date up to Sam Schwartz
Yes.
for their consideration into the overall plan process. Is that?
Yeah, with a
Okay.
little bit added still, but
Sure. Okay.
overall,
Should we make
The,
a formal motion?
this way of doing it seems to have worked.
Okay.
Cool. Which we weren't sure whether that was going to be true or not. Okay. And I think with that, then we move into help me out here. I've lost my agenda.
Yes.
Okay. So Ray's back.
I'm up again. Yep. All right, so as is par for the course, I will go ahead and just highlight the changes from last month to this month. Again, thanks to Madam Chair that you can subscribe to updates so any member of the public can get kind of notified when these updates are posted online. So looking to page 2, there's a little bit of discussion about the annual street resurfacing project. Work is currently occurring on Platt Road, Sheridan, and in the Water Hill neighborhood for resurfacing. Moving on to page 3, there is the language that was forwarded to City Council at their last meeting about the monthly progress report for upgrades to existing crosswalks. So, for example, some of the new language talks about the in-road signs, which we sometimes refer to as the gateway treatments. That there were 97 that were installed at 43 locations, and we actually have to replace them because they get hit. So 6 of them have already been replaced, even though they've only been out for about a month. C'est la vie, right? There are also 2 locations where pedestrian crossing signs were upgraded as well. And then there was some new language about how many streetlights DTE has serviced. And these aren't all necessarily at crosswalks, but just to give you an idea that, since April 1st, 159 streetlight outages have been addressed by DTE. There is some new language on the Duvarn Sidewalk Gap project at the bottom of page 4 and top of page 5. At the very bottom of the page, it says resolutions to approve the special assessment for the project went to council on Monday. If I remember correctly, those actually passed first reading. That looks like it's moving forward, at least, pursuant to the council action last night. There is some updated language on the Ann Arbor STEAM Safe Routes to School project on page 5, about midway down. I think we had reported on this at the last meeting, but it just reflects City Council's decision to not move forward with a special assessment at their May 20th meeting. I think your meeting was 2 days after that. And then the Fuller Road crosswalk sidewalk extension, the next one down, speaks to that the work is scheduled to be completed by the end of August. So there's just a new status update there. This one was actually moved. It was in a different part of the report, so if you thought it went away, it just got shifted to a different part. So just a little heads up on that. The South Side Intercepts sanitary diversion close to the bottom of page 5. That work is currently on hold because there's some issues regarding the railroad, and so we're in a state of suspended animation on that one. The next update to report is kind of towards the top of page 7 under the Nixon Road corridor improvements. Talks about the last line in that paragraph says council passed a budget amendment indicating a desire to explore moving the first phase of construction up to 2021. And so the exact direction as part of the council budgeting process was that staff has to develop a report in terms of the feasibility of those sorts of things. Costs, funding sources, and impacts of moving the project. In other words, what other projects may be impacted by that move. So it's not, the project hasn't moved up in schedule yet, but we've been asked to analyze what would be the impacts if we moved up the Nixon Road project. Then looking at page 8, about halfway down, there is an update on the Ann Arbor Station that a revised draft was submitted to the Federal Railroad Administration on June 7th. And then once we kind of get that back from Federal Railroad Administration, hopefully for the last time, we will schedule a public review period with that. There is new language under MDOT coordination related to North Main Street project and the consultant selection process for that road resurfacing project, or it's actually like a road rebuilding project. And there's also talk about the mid-block crossing on Huron near Thayer and Ingalls. That the state has agreed to a pedestrian hybrid beacon, or a HAWK, that many of you know, at this location, and we're currently working with the state on the implementation timeline. The transportation plan update talks about some of the public engagement that Madam Chair was just discussing. We had the Citizens Advisory Committee, we had the Technical Advisory Committee, we had a walk shop, we had a workshop, and we were at the Mayor's Green Fair. So it kind of captures all those pieces of information. The quiet zone train horn noise, I think we talked a little bit about this. This was forwarded on to council for further direction just late last week or early this week. Pretty much laid out the different alternatives and the costs associated with them, and we'll await direction from council in terms of what we should do next on that. And I believe that concludes the changes from last month to this month. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the Washtenaw and Pittsfield crosswalk. I know that's
Yeah.
under MDOT, but right now, the language still says it's planned for 2019, and now we're getting into the construction season, and I'm wondering what's happening there.
I'm confident that it's still going to happen in 2019. We had there's a transportation work authorization that you need to get from MDOT. We have a draft one of those right now with them. So it is still kind of moving along. We're reevaluating kind of the final costs to make sure that it's reflected properly in the paperwork. But yeah, it should still happen in 2019, fingers crossed.
Is that something the city would pay for, or
Yeah.
just like, because I didn't see it, like, I don't know that I've seen it in any of the, like, I don't know if it falls under the capital improvement project or what it falls under.
You know, let me find out. I'm fairly certain that it is city paid for, but there might be some other funding sources, whether those are federal or other on that project. So I can look into that and get you a better answer.
Questions, Molly?
So just quickly, the Hawk beacon at Huron and Thayer,
Mhm.
is that the same as the pedestrian beacon at the Y?
Yes.
Okay, and is that one changing to a full traffic signal?
I have not heard
Okay.
definitively from MDOT on that. So, yeah, you may recall this was part of the DDA's request. They had kind of three requests to MDOT about Huron. One was that off-peak on-street parking. We have heard no from MDOT on that. Some of the other ones were to allow for protected left turns. So in front of this building, to turn on to Division, for example, to allow, you know, a left arrow, right, a left green arrow. That's an outstanding request. We haven't gotten a definitive answer. And then the other one, as you just mentioned, in front of the Y, to change that from the flashing hybrid beacon to a full-blown intersection, or full-blown traffic signal. So we haven't heard definitively on that either.
If I could follow up on that particular question, I'm wondering about the change from a hawk signal to a full signal. And I'm wondering if there's information there that we need to capture about, is that because it worked so well that there's more people crossing? Is it because it was a failure? What's the data? What's the evidence that we're using to make that decision?
So
the
my
switch.
understanding is that intersection now meets the full warrant for a full-blown traffic signal. And so before, you know, there are these different thresholds in terms of like what sort of control you can put in. You know, from a stop sign, you have to meet certain controls. Up to a hawk, you have to meet certain thresholds. And so there's enough activity there, pedestrian, vehicular, to warrant, in our estimation and by DDA's analysis, a full-blown signal at that intersection.
So do we think that this is an upgrade that was necessary because it drew so much pedestrian traffic, or the traffic has just increased so much on Huron, or do we have the data on that?
I'd be hesitant to suggest cause and effect. I don't know if the hawk or the pedestrian hybrid beacon drew enough people to warrant the signal, but I think just generally speaking, there's enough activity at that location to warrant a full-blown signal. So it's hard for me to kind of answer that directly if there's a causal relationship, but.
Right, I was more expecting a request for, like, if there is data on why this change has occurred, I'd like to see it later and not necessarily rely that you have it on the top of your head.
Okay, gotcha.
'Cause that would be interesting to see why, yeah.
I have a question on the road diet section, not on the ones that are pending, but, so the other locations evaluated by staff include section, are those segments that we looked at and the staff decided not to pursue, or are those just things that are still on the list that could potentially move up depending on how things go?
Yes, so the ones that we advanced were the ones that were a little bit more pressing in terms of time, and we talked about, Traver Wood and Green and how those are up for resurfacing this year. For Earhart, again, it was because of that test environment. On the other ones, I'm stalling because I'm trying to get to the list. On the other locations, we did report on those in February. They're not as time critical just because there's no activity necessarily associated with them. If I remember correctly, we reported out that Platt didn't look like it could be, we could move forward with it. And, you know, we actually met with Commissioner Parsons out there to see what other opportunities there were on like parallel facilities and things of that nature. Not myself, but I think it was Cynthia and Cyrus met out there, is that right? But to answer your question, the other ones that still remain, yes, there's still an opportunity to kind of bring those forward for consideration. We just haven't focused as much energy on them because they're not quite as time sensitive.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious where those were at. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay?
So for the Ann Arbor STEAM School, now that council has voted down the Safe Routes to School project, is the plan to just have an unsafe route to school? Is the city investigating alternatives to improve safety in that area? Like what happens now is my question.
Next question.
Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know exactly, to be honest with you. There have been some ideas that have been floated about, you know, kind of alternative treatments. And so we don't have clear direction in terms of what our next step is. And so I think to be determined is probably my best answer. I know that's a complete cop-out, but I think, oh, sorry. I know that's probably not a correct term, but anyway. I think it's one of those things that we're trying to figure out what to do next.
And I would like to add quickly, you wouldn't know this, but also at the very bottom of this, the Office of Sustainability and Innovation has provided their updates as well.
Anything else? Okay, then we can move on to the next agenda item, which is not Raymond, right?
But it might be.
Or no, it is.
It is.
Yes, so
And I think that this is just an informational bit of
it is, yes. So I believe in one of our past meetings, City Administrator Lazarus had mentioned that there was a study that was done a couple years ago. The results were published back in 2018 that kind of analyzed traffic stop data and kind of equity issues or, you know, issues related to those traffic stops. It was done by a third-party independent consultant. And those results are, you know, he's providing it for informational purposes. I think there's not much to necessarily report. The one thing I did do is on page 2, which is the summary or executive summary, you know, after parsing through some of the methodology, the second bullet point says that the analysis revealed little stop disparity overall, despite drilling down to the district level time of day and reason for stop. Disproportionate stopping was only revealed within 3 demographic groups, and these disparities were isolated in time, location, or reason for stop. All stop disparities proved to be both statistically and substantively small in regard to the proportion of the group stopped. So that seemed to be the most concise finding that I could find in the report, just to share with you all if you didn't have a chance to look through it.
Do we have any comments or discussion about this report?
Thank you. I think this was a request that I made for the enforcement. So thank you.
Yeah, I found it really helpful and good work. I think it reveals what we all hoped we might hear, you know, so it was nice to read. Thanks.
Right, and this is also an opportunity then to make that more public and more available, since it's it's on Legistar, so that anybody can download it.
Very good.
Anything else? Great. Thank you. So I believe that we're going into the liaison reports at this point, yes. There's an Ann Arbor Public Schools update, which again is informational, since Liz is not here, although I suppose if we had any questions, we could come up with them and
Yeah, and Liz sends her regrets. She had to go to a public school board meeting tonight, so that's why she couldn't make it. There is always that kind of ongoing conflict. But yeah, if you do have any questions, whenever she provides a report, we'd be happy to report, get a response from her on those.
Are there any questions? But it's great to continue to have this report included in our packet. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I guess to piggyback off of Molly's question about the A2 Safe Steam, how much, is that a Liz question versus how much is that a city question? Is there overlap there, or? You know what I mean?
No, I don't, sorry.
Well, A2 Safe Steam, the Safe Routes to School is now done, right?
Right,
The city's stopped that. Is Liz the person to ask, what's the follow-up discussion in the neighborhood? Is there any, that kind of thing, or?
Okay, I see what you mean. I got you.
Or the
I'm
school's
with
gonna
you.
take up the topic
Yeah, yeah.
as well as the city?
Yeah. Yeah, we can kind of maybe do a coordinated response, or as things kind of develop, we'll be sure to include that in at least the monthly update, either mine or hers, depending upon which side it comes from. So,
Okay.
I hear you, yeah, we can do that.
All right, Scott.
Just have a brief update from Planning Commission. We don't have anything major. I just wanted to, the people have asked me, and a couple commissioners have asked me where the transit-oriented zoning project is going. And that is something that the planning staff and some of commission had been working on and had been stalled in the last year with other priorities kind of being put on our plate, and a lot going on. But that was placed back on the planning commission work plan at yesterday's meeting for the coming year. So that is something that is moving back up in priority and hopefully will move forward this year. And just as a little bit of background, that's sort of looking at our zoning in our transit corridors to encourage more residential development adjacent to transit, so people can rely on that to get around.
Great. Any other reports from liaisons from, yes?
I think the last meeting I was at was in April, and I talked a little bit about an initiative to help improve the pedestrian crosswalk at North University, which is a super busy crosswalk. And we've been working with Raymond and I on the same group, working on some pilot or new technology that could anticipate transit vehicles approaching and stopping pedestrians. And we just got our first feedback from Federal Highway, and we have a lot more homework to do. So this would be really kind of groundbreaking of what we were trying to do. We might be stepping back and looking at a little bit more traditional treatments. But I bring it up because I think at some point I was going to do a presentation to the commission here, and we've been waiting to get feedback from Federal Highway. So we just got it this, I think it was Tuesday, and so we have more work to do.
So you're talking about the crosswalk right by the central campus transportation hub?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's a crazy one.
Huge numbers. You know, there's 800 buses a day through that
Yeah.
area. It's just a busy place, and so you're holding up lots of mass transit. So anyway, we've been working on it.
Great. Keep us updated. Any other liaison reports? Looking at that end of the table. Okay. As far as reports from the commission, you have my notes from the chair, which I'd like to start doing again, now that I have more energy and time. And I tried to explain what happened with the reappointment process, with mild success. But what it comes down to at this point is that we expect that this is Scott's last meeting, and it could conceivably be Robert's, but we think that's unlikely.
Odds are I'll be here in July.
Yes. And it becomes, it's still rather important that those people, especially those who are voting, come to meetings and notify Kayla in advance if necessary to, if you're not able to make it. His quorum just gets a little bit tighter. Although I did get a chance to talk to Chris Taylor at the Green Fair, and he said that he'll put us at a higher priority for reappointments. So that's essentially my report. Any other communications from commissioners? Scott wanted to say something.
I did. Thanks for letting me take a little bit of time, since this is my last time here, most likely. And if not, then it'll be lovely to see you all again, because we never know. And so I'm just going to say a bunch of thank yous and some thoughts. So I wanted to thank staff, and I particularly wanted to thank Kayla. So I'm sad she's not here today, but I hope Raymond and Nani, you can pass on my thanks. Having been here from the beginning of this commission, and sort of trying to figure out, it's a lot of people from a lot of different places. It's really complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and so educating all of us and helping us all figure out how to be effective and become increasingly effective and figuring out what our role is and how to do that. She's been instrumental and such a great help, in particular, and I think all of staff. That goes for all of staff. Everybody's been great. I think the city is fortunate to have the people that we do on the staff side, are so dedicated, so patient, so diplomatic. I really just want you to know that, like, we get to see it, we get to interact with you all, and it's appreciated. So thank you. Thank you, fellow commissioners, particularly Linda Diane, for the work you did that led up to the creation of this commission, and your work as chair, despite your personal challenges, showing up, keeping the meeting on schedule, keeping things well organized. I really appreciate it. You've done great work. I look forward to the work this commission does under your leadership and beyond. So thank you, and thank you all for all of the time you put in. I know the digging deep into the details and the questions. You all really care about outcomes, and I really appreciate that. And I know this commission will continue to do great work. I also want to thank the community. We don't have as much community engagement as Planning Commission does, but particularly shout out to Clark, who's here at almost every meeting, keeping us informed on regional rail and bus. I really do appreciate that. It's one of my favorite parts of these meetings, to get those updates. So thank you, and thank everybody who comes out and talks. On the community input side, I think one thought I had, sort of reflecting on the conversation that happened at the council table in terms of how do we deal with community input and how do we structure that. And I'm getting this sense from that council kind of wants it to be treated more like Planning Commission, where something comes to Transportation Commission and then we hear the whole thing, have a big public hearing, have the opportunity, and then package it all up, and only then does it go on to City Council. And I just want to, I don't know if that's the intent of where things are going, but I want to question that as an effective public engagement process. That is one that's heavily driven by sort of their legal requirements. And I don't know if it's always the most productive way to hear the community in a really broad and effective way. And I do think having attended a lot of staff-run public engagement sessions, those I think are great because they allow for dialogue and they allow for conversation and they allow for sitting down and looking at the map and talking about it. And that, I think, it goes much further than having a really formal, structured public hearing. And I just hope it doesn't go in that direction. So I'm just, to really formalize it, just to stretch things out as opposed to actually do effective public engagement. Let's see, I'm just a whole bunch of notes I wrote down before I came in today. On the micromobility ordinance, I'm sad I will not be here to see that complete. I know that's stuck in legal right now, and I know our attorneys are very busy with some high priority things, so I understand why that hasn't risen to the top of the list. But I will be keeping track of that if if that subcommittee is looking for a member of the public who would like to participate, feel free to invite me. I'd be happy to continue sit in on that subcommittee to help push that over the line if it comes back up. Because I think dealing both with the operators and all these new vehicle types and how we're going to deal with that is a really interesting set of problems to me, and so I'm happy to continue to engage on that work. I also will say that I don't know the nominees that are likely to replace the two planning commissioners, myself and Commissioner Weatherby. But based on resumes and things I've heard, they look like great additions. And one way or the other, there will be another planning commission representative here. And I think that's a really important role. I think land use and transportation are really integral to each other. And I hope we can keep finding ways to think as a city about how those things tie together. Sort of the different, we talk about how we move people and things around, and the land use talks about, the destinations those things are going to. And so it's really fundamental, about how those things work together, and it ties into equity, it ties into housing affordability, it ties into access to jobs, it ties into public health, it ties into sustainability, and how we will respond to the climate crisis to survive the changes that are coming and hopefully stave off the worst. And so this is all really important work. So anyway, I'm looking forward to see where that goes. Another conversation we'll be following. My last point, again, thinking about how we hear the community, to remember the community isn't just the vocal minority. I think those people will be heard and should be heard. But there are other ways to listen. And so, for example, one of the things, again, going back to the road diet conversation that happened at City Council and has been going on, is the city did the citizen survey, which was a scientifically valid sampled survey of people's opinions. And one of the things that actually Ryan Hughes is in the audience here pointed out to me was there's a section there that we asked people, how much of a delay would you tolerate if it meant an improvement to safety for pedestrians and cyclists on the road, or to reduce crashes? What's that? And cars, right? So basically, would you accept a delay in a 10-minute stretch? Right now, if it takes you 10 minutes, would you accept a 1-minute delay? Would you accept a 3-minute delay, and so on? And 84% of respondents, and this is a scientific sample, said they would happily accept a 1-minute delay for a 10-minute road segment, and 66% said a 3-minute would accept a 3-minute delay. So that those people might not be the people showing up really angry about a change because they don't want to see a change happen, but that's a significant majority of our residents have said, hey, safety is important, we can slow down, it's okay. But they're not going to necessarily show up and yell at us. So make sure we're listening to those other ways that we can hear from the community and really understand what the values are, because those sort of broad, general, not strongly held, but opinions matter too. So something to think about. Also, just as a role of this commission vis-a-vis council, I hope we continue to be independent voices. I think this, as Linda Diane tried to say, she characterized the renomination process, which is difficult to explain because I don't think any of us really understands the real reasoning of what went on. I think it ended up being unclear, unnecessarily divisive. I don't think it was productive. And I just hope that this commission continues to look at the city's interests as a whole and not just not being worried about the loud voices who show up in primaries to vote, which council members may have to worry about that, but we don't. And so thinking about the city's interests as a whole to balance that and really help to encourage and support council members who are willing to lead with evidence-based improvements and take a bigger picture view than just how fast we can move cars, because that's not what transportation is, that's not what mobility is, that's not what access is. It's about moving people to places and moving things to places, and that doesn't necessarily mean cars. And I know most of the people sitting at this table probably would agree with me on that. But I think that's a really important big picture thing to keep in mind as we go forward, and I have confidence you will all continue to do that. And I look forward to being on the other side of this table as an advocate going forward as all of this stuff keeps moving. So thank you all for the opportunity. I've learned a whole lot, and you haven't seen the last of me.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much, Scott. I mean, I really miss you. And so will the city.
Other communications from commissioners?
Yeah, I know we had a little discussion last week about state crosswalk laws, and today, or actually
That's
yesterday.
the next agenda item.
Yeah, this is what I'm wondering. I'm just wondering, since now language is out, how are we going to act as a commission and what
Yeah.
will be on for the next meeting?
Yep, that's very appropriate. We're talking about the next agenda. Okay, anything else? All right. Then we can talk about the next agenda. I'm going to segue both from Tim and from Scott, which is that I've already asked Kayla to speak briefly, probably at the July meeting, about some of the work that she's been doing in engagement, public engagement. That she's been attending conferences and doing some very exciting things all across the country, and we don't really know or appreciate how much she has gained from that experience. And so that's already on the agenda, which pertains exactly to what Scott had mentioned. As far as the state crosswalk, that has moved faster than we anticipated, and there was an indication that we wanted to have that as an agenda item when it became more pertinent, and it is. And so exactly our legal ability and role in influencing state legislation has to be vetted a bit, but some sort of action, resolution of that kind of thing would be very appropriate. And we need to be able to have a few ideas for that at the next meeting without actually deliberating in between. So, yes, we're going to devote time to that. But we have to, exactly who it's directed at is partly a question. And so we have to come up with that answer first.
I want to invite Rodney Peterson.
Okay? We can consider that?
As well as, I would imagine, our reps, so is that,
Yusuf Rabi and Rebecca Warren?
yeah, exactly. So, can we do that?
I don't know exactly what, our bylaws say that we're advising city council, and we don't necessarily have it within our scope to advise the whole state. So if there's a way to do it, yes, but it's a little tricky. We'll have to work on that.
Yeah,
But I hear you.
as staff, we'll kind of research that a little bit more. We started the conversation a little while ago, but we didn't kind of come to conclusion on it. So we'll do our part on that to figure out what your action should be directed at, or who your action should be directed at.
At the very least, it can be directed towards city council. And there may be other creative ways as well. This commission has come out strongly in favor of crosswalk law, which is up to the standards of the Ann Arbor crosswalk law, and what has been proposed is not that.
Yeah, my question about that, I don't know if it's not clear in the language, though it may be somewhere else in state law, is whether the passage of this language as drafted would preempt the Ann Arbor law, or whether Ann Arbor would be able to have a stronger law.
That issue has come up many times in many variety of ways. I don't think there's a definitive answer yet, is there?
Not that I'm aware of. Sorry. Not that I'm aware of.
Starting with the pot law is when that.
Yeah, I mean, the other one was the passing, the 3-foot versus the 5-foot passing law. So, you know,
Right.
this issue kind of comes up,
Plastic bag bill.
plastic bag bill.
1972 with the pot law is the earliest one I'm aware of.
Well, in this case, we have a stronger law, like, as far as like,
Yeah, well, okay, we'll add that to the questions.
Yeah, and I think it also probably depends on how the law is written too, right? I mean, I think there's probably, sometimes there's, yeah. But we'll look into it, the current draft, and see what legal can
So the
provide.
other agenda item I see is that we need to appoint Scott to the micromobility task force, or committee. So- You're out of order. It has to be on the agenda. Are there other agenda items?
There is the work plan, which I can go over briefly, just so you all know it's coming up next month. We have the DDA Fifth and Detroit Bikeway Education and Outreach coming up, as well as an Ann Arbor Station update. That one's tentative. And we did have the North University Crosswalk Project, but Steve already updated us on that, so that will not be on next month. And the next the next Transportation Commission meeting is Wednesday, July 17th at 7 p.m. in this room, City Council chambers.
All right.
yeah, one question, as far as this crosswalk thing, how are we gonna go about, if we end up drafting something, how are we gonna go about drafting it? Because I know there's the thing with the FOIA and quorum, and we don't know what's gonna happen when right now.
We can always draft something based upon our prior actions and, which is an indication of where the commission is leaning.
Yeah,
But it needs to fit into the current laws and scene and whatever. So, and then if the commission says, no, we want something completely different than that, then we can revise it with deliberation at the meeting.
okay.
And Kayla can always help you coordinate between commissioners if you're worried about avoiding a quorum or drafting anything. She's available.
Yep. But clearly, it will be happening, yes. Anything else? Then if there's no objection, I will declare this meeting adjourned.